The rain hammered against the windows of the small farmhouse in rural Pennsylvania as Margaret Collins sat at her kitchen table, staring at the faded photograph in her trembling hands. The black and white image showed a young soldier in British uniform, his smile confident and bright, standing beside what looked like an enormous artillery piece. Her grandfather, Thomas Collins, had been dead for 30 years, but the stories he told before Alzheimer's stole his memories had haunted her family ever since. Margaret was a high school history teacher, 42 years old, divorced, and struggling to keep her late grandfather's farm from foreclosure. The bank had given her 60 days. 60 days to find a reason to keep the land that had been in her family since 1946, when Thomas returned from the war and used his veterans' benefits to start fresh in America. She had been cleaning out the attic when she found it. Not just the photograph, but a leather journal, wrapped in oilcloth and hidden beneath the floorboards. The pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with her grandfather's handwriting. The first entry was dated April 1944, somewhere in southern England. They call it obsolete. They call it a relic from the last war. But I've seen what this gun can do. The 25-pounder. They don't understand. The Germans fear it more than anything else we have. Margaret's hands shook as she turned the pages. Her grandfather had never talked about the war in detail. He would mention England, mention the artillery regiment, but whenever anyone pressed for stories, his eyes would grow distant and he'd change the subject. Her grandmother once told her that Thomas would wake up screaming in the night, shouting coordinates and names of men nobody in the family had ever met. Outside, her daughter Emma's car pulled into the driveway. At 19, Emma was home from college for the summer, working 2 jobs to help with expenses. She burst through the door, soaking wet, her red hair plastered to her face. "Mom, the bank called again. They want an answer by Friday." Margaret didn't look up from the journal. She was reading an entry from June 1944, just after D-Day. "We landed on Gold Beach 3 days after the initial assault. The 25-pounder batteries were priority. Command knew. Even with all the new American equipment, all their fancy guns and unlimited ammunition, they needed us. They needed our gun. Yesterday we fired 400 rounds in 6 hours. The Germans were dug in outside Cannes. Nothing could reach them, but we could. We always could." Emma sat down across from her mother, noticing the photograph for the first time. She picked it up carefully. "Is that Grandpa Tom?" Margaret nodded, finally looking up at her daughter. Her eyes were red, but not from crying. From excitement. "Emma, I think I know why he bought this specific piece of land." "What do you mean?" Margaret stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the rolling fields that stretched behind the house. 200 acres of Pennsylvania farmland, unremarkable except for one feature. A hill, steep and isolated, that rose from the eastern edge of the property. He never farmed that hill, never touched it. When I was a kid, he told me it was too rocky, too steep. But look at this. She turned to a page near the end of the journal. There was a hand-drawn map, crude but detailed. It showed terrain features, elevation markers, and firing coordinates. At the bottom, in capital letters, her grandfather had written, "Just like home." Emma leaned over her mother's shoulder, studying the drawing. "I don't understand." Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. "He recreated it. The hill. It matches the terrain descriptions in his journal. The gun positions outside Cannes. He bought this farm because the land reminded him of where he fought, where he and his crew did something that changed the war." Emma sat back down, overwhelmed. "Mom, even if that's true, how does it help us? The bank doesn't care about war history. We need money, not stories." Margaret was already reaching for her laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She pulled up an email from 3 months ago, one she had ignored because it seemed too strange, too unlikely. The message was from Dr. Robert Chun, a military historian at the Smithsonian Institution. He had been researching Allied artillery operations in Normandy and had come across references to a Sergeant Thomas Collins in British Army records. He wanted to know if any family members had journals, letters, or photographs from his service. Margaret had deleted the email without responding. She had been too busy worrying about money, about keeping the farm, about surviving. But now she opened her sent folder and began typing a new message. Dr. Chun, I apologize for my delayed response. I have found my grandfather's wartime journal. It contains detailed accounts of operations involving the British 25-pounder gun. I believe you'll find it very interesting. Can we talk? She hit send before she could change her mind. Emma watched her mother, confused and worried. Mom, what are you doing? Margaret looked at her daughter, and for the first time in months, she smiled. Buying us time. And maybe, just maybe, giving Grandpa Tom the recognition he deserved. Dr. Chun responded within 2 hours. His email was brief but urgent. I can be in Pennsylvania tomorrow. This could be extremely important. Margaret barely slept that night. She spent hours reading through her grandfather's journal, discovering a war story that had been hidden in plain sight for decades. Thomas Collins hadn't just served with a British artillery regiment. He had been part of something extraordinary, something that military historians had overlooked for 70 years. The next morning, a sleek black sedan pulled up to the farmhouse. Dr. Chun stepped out, a thin man in his 50s wearing glasses and carrying a leather briefcase. But he wasn't alone. Behind him emerged a woman in an expensive business suit, her expression cold and calculating. Ms. Collins, I'm Sandra Whitmore from the Department of Defense Historical Archives Division. Dr. Chun contacted us about your grandfather's journal. We'd like to see it. Margaret felt her stomach drop. Something was wrong. Dr. Chun wouldn't meet her eyes. Inside the kitchen, Margaret placed the journal on the table. Sandra Whitmore barely glanced at it before opening her briefcase and pulling out an official-looking document. Ms. Collins, this journal contains classified information related to Allied artillery operations. Under the National Security Act, we're required to confiscate it for review. Emma, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped forward angrily. Classified? It's 70 years old. How can it still be classified? Sandra's smile was practiced and empty. Military operational details don't have expiration dates, Miss Collins, especially when they involve foreign military assets and tactical procedures that remain relevant. Dr. Chun finally spoke, his voice apologetic. Margaret, I had to report it. Once I saw the references in your email about the 25-pounder operations outside Ken, I was obligated to contact DOD. I'm sorry. Margaret grabbed the journal, holding it against her chest. This is my grandfather's story. His words. You can't just take it. Sandra pulled out another document, this one with multiple official seals. Actually, we can. And we will. You have 2 options. Surrender it voluntarily, or we obtain a federal warrant. Either way, the journal comes with us today. However, if you cooperate, the government is prepared to offer compensation. $5,000. $5,000? Emma's voice cracked with disbelief. We're losing our farm. We need 10 times that just to catch up on the mortgage. Sandra closed her briefcase with a sharp click. That's not my concern. The offer stands for the next 60 seconds. Margaret looked down at her grandfather's handwriting, at the decades-old words describing courage and sacrifice. She thought about Thomas Collins, who had survived the war only to spend his final years forgetting everything he'd done. Now even his memories were being taken away. She looked at Sandra Whitmore's impassive face and made a decision that would change everything. No. The single word hung in the air like a gunshot. Sandra Whitmore's expression hardened into something dangerous. Miss Collins, you're making a serious mistake. Obstruction of a federal investigation carries significant penalties. Margaret stood her ground, though her legs were shaking. Then get your warrant. Until then, this journal stays with me. Sandra and Dr. Chun left 20 minutes later, the tension thick enough to cut. As soon as their car disappeared down the driveway, Emma grabbed her mother's arm. Mom, what did you just do? They're going to come back with federal agents. Margaret was already at her laptop, her fingers trembling as she typed. Then we need to move faster than they do. She opened her grandfather's journal to a specific entry, one that had caught her attention during the night. June 18, 1944. Thomas described a massive artillery bombardment that had stopped a German panzer division cold. But it wasn't just the battle he described. It was something else. something that explained why the 25-pounder was so feared. Emma read over her mother's shoulder. "What am I looking at?" Margaret pointed to a series of numbers and coordinates her grandfather had written in the margins. "These aren't just battle records. They're firing solutions. Mathematical calculations that made the 25-pounder more accurate than anything else on the battlefield. Grandpa Tom and his regiment had developed a technique, a method of rapid calculation that let them adjust fire in seconds instead of minutes. The Germans couldn't hide from it, couldn't predict it. So what? How does that help us?" Margaret was already uploading photos of the journal pages to a military history forum she'd found online. Within minutes, responses started flooding in. Historians, veterans, artillery experts. They were stunned. One message stood out, from a user named British Gunner 1942. "Holy God, this is the Lost Preston method. We've been looking for documentation of this for decades. Your grandfather was part of the original team." Margaret's phone rang. Unknown number. She answered. "Miss Collins, my name is James Preston. I'm 89 years old and I served with your grandfather in the 147th Field Regiment. I've been trying to find proof of what we did for 50 years. That journal is the only complete record that exists." Margaret's voice caught in her throat. "Mr. Preston, the government wants to take it. They're calling it classified." James Preston laughed. A bitter sound. "Of course they are. Because it proves the British developed the most effective artillery technique of the war, and the Americans buried it in classified files rather than admit they didn't invent it themselves. Miss Collins, don't give them that journal. Not yet. If you're following this story and want to see how Margaret fights back against the government, hit that subscribe button right now. Because what happens next is going to shock you." James Preston arrived at the farm 2 days later, a frail man with sharp eyes and a cane. He brought with him something Margaret never expected. 3 other veterans, all in their late 80s, all former members of the 147th Field Regiment. They sat in Margaret's living room like ghosts from another era. These old men who had once been young soldiers operating the most feared gun in Europe. "Your grandfather saved my life," James said quietly, touching the journal with reverence. "Ken, June 19th. A German 88 had us zeroed. Tommy calculated a counter-battery solution in 40 seconds. 40 seconds. The Jerrys never fired again." Another veteran, a man named Arthur Webb, leaned forward. The 25-pounder wasn't outdated. It was perfect. Fast enough to move, accurate enough to hit anything, versatile enough to fire in any role. But it was Tommy and the others who made it legendary. The Preston method wasn't just mathematics. It was art. Margaret felt tears building but fought them back. "The government wants to bury this. They've threatened me with federal charges." James smiled grimly. "Then we go public. All of us. We tell the world what that gun did, what your grandfather did. Let them try to silence 5 families and 4 living witnesses." Over the next week, Margaret's life transformed into controlled chaos. Emma helped her create a website documenting the journal entries. James Preston connected them with a British military museum that had been searching for Preston method documentation for decades. Arthur Webb contacted a documentary filmmaker who specialized in overlooked war stories. The bank called again. Margaret told them she needed 30 more days. They laughed and said she had 7. Then the story broke. Not through traditional media but through social media. A viral thread on Twitter started by a military history professor who had seen Margaret's forum posts. Within 48 hours, the hashtag #PreserveCollinsJournal was trending. Veterans organizations from 3 countries issued statements supporting Margaret. The British Embassy quietly reached out, expressing interest in the historical significance. Sandra Whitmore showed up again, this time with 2 federal agents. But she also brought something else, a new offer. The Smithsonian wants the journal for their World War II collection. We're prepared to offer $200,000 and full public access to the documents. Your grandfather will be credited as a key figure in Allied artillery operations. Margaret looked at the government officials, then at James Preston and the other veterans sitting in her living room. Not good enough. The journal stays with the family. We'll provide copies for research, but the original remains here. And there's one more condition. Sandra's jaw tightened. What condition? Margaret walked to the window, looking out at the hill her grandfather had never touched. You're gonna help me turn that hill into a memorial. Proper one. For the 147th Field Regiment and every artillery crew that used the Preston method. My grandfather bought this land for a reason. It's time we honored that. 3 months later, Margaret stood on top of her grandfather's hill, watching construction crews put the finishing touches on the memorial. The design was simple but powerful. A restored British 25-pounder artillery piece, positioned exactly as it would have been in Normandy, surrounded by bronze plaques bearing the names of every soldier who had served in the 147th Field Regiment. The government had fought her at first, but public pressure had been overwhelming. Veterans groups, historical societies, and tens of thousands of social media supporters had made it impossible to refuse. The Smithsonian had increased their offer to $300,000 for exclusive research access to high-resolution scans of the journal. The original would remain with Margaret, displayed in a climate-controlled case in her home, open to researchers by appointment. The mortgage was paid off. The farm was saved. But more importantly, Thomas Collins finally had his recognition. Emma walked up beside her mother, carrying a folder of papers. Mom, you need to see this. The documentary crew sent over the final edit. It's going to premiere on the History Channel next month. Margaret took the folder but didn't open it. She was watching James Preston slowly make his way up the hill, supported by his grandson. At 89, the climb was difficult, but he had insisted on being here for the dedication ceremony. When he reached the top, James placed his hand on the cold metal of the 25-pounder, and tears streamed down his weathered face. We called them the guns that won the war, he said softly. Not because they were the biggest or the newest, because they were there when we needed them, and they never let us down. Just like Tommy, just like all of us. Margaret opened her grandfather's journal one last time, turning to the final entry. It was dated May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. Thomas had written only a few lines. The guns are silent now. We're going home. I don't know if anyone will remember what we did here, or understand why this gun mattered so much. But I'll remember. Every man I served with. Every round we fired. Every life we saved. That has to be enough. Margaret's voice was steady as she read the words aloud to the small crowd gathered for the memorial dedication. Veterans, historians, local community members, and a camera crew documenting everything. When she finished, there was silence. Then Arthur Webb began to clap, slowly at first, then joined by others. The applause echoed across the Pennsylvania hillside, a sound that would have made Thomas Collins smile. Sandra Whitmore approached Margaret after the ceremony, her expression softer than it had been months ago. You know, Miss Collins, we really did think we were protecting national security. Sometimes we forget that history belongs to everyone, not just governments. Margaret shook her hand. My grandfather fought for freedom. That includes the freedom to remember, to honor, to never forget. Sandra nodded and walked away. Emma hugged her mother tightly. Grandpa Tom would be proud. Margaret looked out at the memorial, at the gun that had once struck fear into Nazi Europe, now standing as a testament to courage and sacrifice. He already is. 2 years later, the Collins Farm Memorial had become one of Pennsylvania's most visited historical sites. Over 50,000 people came each year to see the 25-pounder, to read Thomas Collins' journal entries displayed in the small museum Margaret had built in the renovated barn, and to understand why this supposedly outdated weapon had been the most feared gun in Nazi Europe. Margaret stood in the museum's entrance, greeting a group of British veterans who had flown in specifically to see the memorial. They were in their 90s now, some in wheelchairs, but their eyes lit up when they saw the gun positioned on the hill. James Preston had passed away 6 months earlier, peacefully in his sleep. His grandson had called Margaret personally to tell her that James' final words were about Tommy Collins and the 147th Regiment. At the funeral, they played a recording of James describing the Preston method, his voice strong and clear despite his age, explaining the mathematical elegance that had made their gun crews unstoppable. Emma had graduated from college and now ran the memorial full-time. She had expanded it beyond just World War II, creating educational programs about artillery history, hosting veteran groups, and coordinating with military academies studying historical tactics. The Preston method was now taught at West Point as an example of innovative battlefield mathematics. The documentary had won an Emmy. 3 books had been published about the 25-pounder and its crews. Thomas Collins was no longer a forgotten veteran with a fading memory. He was a recognized hero, his contributions finally understood and celebrated. Margaret walked up the hill one evening, as she did most days, and sat beside the gun. She had placed a small photograph there, protected under glass. Young Tommy Collins, smiling confidently beside an identical artillery piece 78 years ago. "We did it, Grandpa," she whispered. "Everyone knows now." A school bus pulled into the parking area below. 30 children poured out, excited and loud, their teacher organizing them for a tour. Margaret smiled. This was what mattered. Not the money, not the recognition, but ensuring that future generations understood the sacrifice and ingenuity of ordinary people who had done extraordinary things. Her phone buzzed. Another email from a veteran's family, this one from Australia, asking if they could add their grandfather's name to the memorial registry. He had served with a different artillery regiment but had trained with men from the 147th. Margaret replied immediately, "Of course. Every gunner deserves to be remembered." As the sun set over the Pennsylvania hills, casting long shadows across the memorial, Margaret felt a peace she hadn't known in years. Her grandfather's story had been saved, his legacy secured, and the gun he had served with such distinction stood proudly once more, no longer forgotten, no longer dismissed as outdated. It stood as a reminder that sometimes the most powerful weapons aren't the newest or the flashiest. Sometimes they're the ones wielded by people who refuse to give up, who calculate impossible solutions, and who fight not for glory, but because it's the right thing to do.